Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we've got a question and answer time. So there was a gentleman here who earlier asked me to speak, and I wasn't able to give him the time.
Thank you very much. Jacek Marczyński. I have two questions. First, to Mr. Ciechanowski, if you can tell us more about the V1 and V2 missiles, because he didn't mention, I think it was also important in the Polish intelligence. And second question is to Mr. Peter from Minnesota, from Mississippi. Paprzycki, thank you. Have you been using any artificial intelligence programs or machine learning in your studies? This is my question, of course, more technical. Thank you.
Thank you for this question. I showed the picture of V1 and V2 weapons, not rockets. And it was a great achievement of the Polish intelligence, of the Home Army, first of all, to have an intelligence network, very efficient one, in Peenemünde, which was crucial for the preparation of the bombing of this installation. It was a German territory, so it was not very easy to send the agents there. Later, a great action to deliver the fragments of these weapons to the United Kingdom. And it was also a big Polish operation. Unfortunately, there are a lot of books about it in Polish. We don't have many in English. That's a very important task to change this situation. And of course, I mentioned Air Captain Roman Czerniawski, who was misinforming Germans about the real results of the bombing of London. So it's a big story, and I think it's one of the most important elements of the activity of all these successes of the Home Army intelligence. Home Army intelligence, where there were 17,000 members and 30,000 Poles involved. Great intelligence, massive intelligence effort. Thank you.
Mr. Ciechanowski, could you, could you tell us anything about Christine Granville in regards to her work in the Polish underground?
Of course, Christine Granville, Krystyna Skarbek, Countess Skarbek, she was a very important British agent. A Pole who was used in very important operations in many countries. First of all in France, but not only. One of the bravest agents, I think, of the Second World War. And, well, that's another subject. That's another subject because we have the Polish intelligence service, both in occupied Poland and in the posts abroad, but we have also a lot of Poles working for the Allies. In America, Operation Eagle. A lot of Americans of Polish origin. In Great Britain, they had also some Poles involved in British activities, Granville, but also Andrew Kawerski, and many others, Klementyna Mańkowska, many others who played an important role. So it was, I think, massive participation, and of course about Krystyna Skarbek we have very good books written by Anglo-Saxon authors, and we have a full access to the documentation which is stored at the National Archives in Kew near London. So it's quite famous story. But I'm sure that there are more documents which should be revealed, because still the situation is that some documents are still closed. So there will be a big staff of work for us in the future. Thank you.
Mr. Papszycki, would you like to, or rather Professor Papszycki, would you like to answer this gentleman's question?
I had just a question whether in your research you're using artificial intelligence or machine learning program. That's the question.
So the machine learning is actually a separate field, and there are a number of different important developments: decision trees, supported vector machines, neural networks, and so forth and so on. These are very conducive models for analysis of a lot of data with a lot of variables. So like we're talking about the demographics, well, we'll have only 5-6 demographics, but if you have 15,000 elements where you're trying to predict, for example, consumer behavior, like Google does, or Facebook, or Amazon, they're really leaders in that, and a lot of the models actually originated at MIT, but have been advanced through R and also through Python programming. And they're very conducive for that, but not really for data application, which is really explaining. In artificial intelligence, they don't care about the model and about explaining. They just care about the outcome. So that's, in a nutshell, what the answer is.
We've got some time. Come on.
Were you pointing at me or this gentleman behind?
How about you first?
Okay,
And then
I'll
we'll
go
get that
first.
person next.
I'll try to be brief.
That's all right.
We may need to translate for Professor Mugiel.
We have a translator.
Excellent. I know we were speaking German before. I don't speak Polish, and his English isn't great, so we'll do translation, I guess. Fascinating point about these laws regarding collaboration or turning over of polls. If I've read correctly, though, I believe that there was a mirror imaging with the Home Army, the Armia Krajowa, that actually tried to impose penalties on Poles who would turn in Jews to the German authorities. Perhaps someone can correct me if I'm wrong. I just want to establish, is this actually correct then, that after about November of 1942, Poles were in a situation where if they turned Jews over to the German authorities, they might be subject to draconian punishment by the Home Army, and if they did not, they would be then executed by the Germans. Do I have that correct?
Hold on, let's Yvonne will get you a mic. Mr. Mugiel, we're going to allow her to answer, and then you can answer, please.
Yeah, my dad was a member of the Home Army and a member of an elite group called Kediv, and one of his assignments was to actually execute traitors, and among those were people who tormented or turned in Jews, yeah. So it's true.
Okay. Yes. Sir, was your question answered?
Yes, if Professor Mugiel wants to continue, of course.
To ja może powiem po polsku. Oczywiście AK, podziemie, takie postawy, bo były denuncjacje, ja tylko mówiłem tu o ustawodawstwie, ale nie mówiłem o takiej patologicznej czy o kolaboracji, bo to są jakby dwa różne tematy.
Well, there were people who collaborated, which was negative, and there were people who wanted to help, and we have to separate between that.
A ja mówiłem tylko o rozporządzeniach dotyczących wymuszania, czy tak, a są inne, oczywiście Niemcy starali się wciągnąć Polaków do współpracy, do prześladowania Żydów. Takie próby były i niektóre miały sukces, oczywiście.
Do nieprzetrzymywania Żydów, do wydalania Żydów.
Tak, ale w ogóle do kolaboracji, do kolaboracji były oczywiście, kolaboracja była po stronie polskiej przy prześladowaniu Żydów, ona była, tylko nie była na tyle wystarczająca, żeby to Niemców zadowoliło. O,
Czyli Niemcy zachęcali do kolaboracji.
oczywiście, to bardzo.
So the Germans incentivized the Poles to collaborate with the Jews. On the one hand, there were those decrees banning the Poles from the collaboration, but on the other hand, they were incentivizing or motivating Poles to collaborate with Jews.
Takie postawy były i podziemie, i takie postawy były i podziemie starało się to ścigać.
And the underground state tried to pursue that.
Ale możliwości były bardzo małe.
But the possibilities were very limited.
I to są wyroki śmierci, ich tak dużo nie było?
There were death sentences, however, not so many of those.
A Niemcy chronili kobolantów i swoich kapusi.
And the Germans were hiding away and covering for those who collaborated because they were interested in.
I see, are you standing up for your feet?
Can
Relaxing?
So, excuse me, so I would like to express what was very important, that these sentences were announced in underground press to affect the traitors and to warn them, to would-be traitors, not to do such things. But such announcements were issued in underground press only after the middle of 1943, when the number of Jews trying to survive on the Aryan side was already very limited. And in February 1944, the field commanders of the Home Army were given I will use a term, free hand to act against the traitors. It was not necessary to get a sentence from the underground court. So, and because of this, we do not know number of such executions carried out from February 1944, but from the period earlier and later, we know very few sentences, very few. And we must understand that it could influence the behavior of population only after it was announced that for such deeds there will be such a hard punishment. But it happened only from the middle of 1943.
Sir.
Okay, I have some comments and a few questions for very short questions for Dr. Berendt regarding his talk, because this issue of the Holocaust and the cooperation, what they say about the cooperation of the Poles with the Holocaust interests me a lot. And in fact, one of the reasons that I am here is that I had to write an article about that in Spain to clarify some points. Therefore, first of all, I want to point out that there are some historians that tell that between 10% or 20% of the blue policemen were executed by the Germans during the war, and that almost 50% of them, of the total number of blue policemen, cooperated with the Polish underground. I would like to know if these figures are real or not. Secondly, I have read that some historians like Hans G. Furth and George C. Lucas in the journals of studies about the genocide and the Holocaust estimated the number of Poles that somehow cooperated in the saving of Jews in around 1 million. I would like to know if you consider these figures an overestimation or if it is impossible to know. The Israel War Commission estimated that less than 0.1% of the Polish population cooperated actively with the Germans. Again, how true can this? How seriously can we take these figures? And also, if there is the number of Polish that were executed for helping Jews, because during my investigation I found all kind of figures from around 100 till 30,000. So it was really difficult to take one decision. So thank you very much.
Professor Berendt, you'd like to come up here, or whatever you'd like to do, it's welcome.
What we know about so-called blue police. Altogether, there were about 18,000 officers, some 3/4 of them from the pre-war time, and the 1/4 were people recruited during the German occupation, and 10% or 20% you mentioned, it would mean at least 1,800 or double number of this. We have no information that such a large percentage of blue police officers were executed, but, for example, Professor Musiał found an information that a group of about 200, he can confirm, 200 officers were sent to Auschwitz and murdered in Auschwitz, German Nazi concentration camps. So, look, how many Poles were helping Jews to survive? I mentioned that we can name about 10,000 people. And we can take their names from testimonies of survivors from other sources, because both the rescuers and the Jews were murdered during the war. So only other eyewitnesses could tell the story of these people murdered. Think about your personal experience. If you are from a large city or a smaller city or a Polish village, what you know about the pre-war number of Jews? How many of them survived? How many of them survived because of help of neighbors, of Christian neighbors? I use a term Christian neighbor because in central Poland, these were Poles who helped. In the east, Ukrainians, Belarusians, to some extent, also Lithuanians. And for example, I mentioned the example of Drohobych. We know that in the town of Drohobych, about 200 Jews survived, hidden by and helped by local Poles and Ukrainians. But the number of these local Poles and Ukrainians was only 80, as I mentioned, out of 20,000 people. For example, in a village, a large village in Gmina of my mother, there were about 2,000 Jews who used to live over there before the German aggression. No one of these Jews survived the German occupation on spot. The only girl helped by one family was a girl born in 1940, not in this village, outside. This girl, 2 years old, was given in October 1942 to the villagers when the family was already led to transport to death camp. But from the local Jews, nobody survived. And we must ask ourselves such a question. If we are talking about 1 million, you mentioned this number, what does it mean? It is 1 of the 20th of the statistical poll, because we were 24 millions at that time. So it means that from an infant to a very old person, 1 of 20 used to help Jews. We have no confirmation of such numbers. I can assure you, even I would like, you cannot. For example, why I am so sure, I am so convinced telling you this. The problem is that, for example, I was asked, and I worked 1 year to make a list of known Polish citizens who used to help Jews. And I did this task for the IPN, and because of this, I mentioned a number of about 10,000 persons. I was putting together everything using all sources to create the list. And so I met many times the same case presented in various sources. 10,000 is a lot, but it is 10,000 persons out of 24 millions. How many Polish citizens collaborated with Germans? So first of all, Germans forced to carry out their orders people who had any official post in police, as a village leader, in administration, and these people were as we told in między młotem a kowadłem.
They were between the, or the dead and the Devil Blue Sea, something like that.
And for example, we can find such a situation when there was no German, so blue police officer turned back to a Jew, and a person could run away. But if there was a German, the blue police officer did his horrible work. Did it. Because otherwise he would have committed suicide. And for example, it was the so-called institution of hostages. So there were people chosen in villages, 3 of them or more, that were responsible for giving in strangers who appeared in villages. And if somebody was caught in the village or in the town, a person that was who was not reported to the Germans, these hostages were to be persecuted. And creating such a system of horror, of terror, they made the system to a great extent effective. It worked to some extent. You can it was not, there was no full success, and it is what Professor Musiał mentioned. And because of this, Germans repeated and repeated all these ordinances that who helped Jews outside ghetto with no permission, such a person will be punished. So because of this, people did not follow orders. They repeated these orders in 1942, 1943, but still the others followed the orders, and as officers of auxiliary police, but not only these people. How many people died because of helping Jews? For sure, we have names of about 700 persons who were murdered on spot. It happened especially in villages because Germans killing people on spot wanted to terrorize the local population. And these people are mentioned in many, these people and this situation are mentioned in many sources. We have also people sent to jails or to concentration camps, and it happened that many of them died in concentration camps, but some of them survived. From 1943 and in 1944, it happened when Hans Frank used his right to release or zmniejszyć wyrok?
To change the sentence, to
reduce the sentence from a capital punishment to a 3 years long imprisonment. It happened, but not in 1942 when there were thousands of Jews trying to escape, to survive, but we know such decisions issued by Hans Frank only from 1943 and 1944. Maybe because they were losing the war. I do not know explanation, but it also happened. But the number, for sure, confirmed number, is about 700 at the moment, and there is a project carried out by a team in the Institute of National Remembrance, and members of these teams are verifying information about another mentioned cases mentioned in sources, and the 700 person killed or who died because of help in concentration camps. So this number will be larger, but I will not tell you that it will be really a much larger number than this 700. I doubt it, because we did so much and were not able to gather a lot of information to mention a number of 2,000 or something like this. On the other hand, the fact that the number is limited can be presented in a positive way, but because it means that with all these several dozen thousand Jews who survived on the Aryan side, this treachery activity of blackmailers was not so much effective, and the number of traitors, because otherwise the number of executed people would have been much larger. It is my opinion and what so I am talking already 10 minutes, so.
Got another question for you. How many families, do you have numbers for families that were killed as a result of the order saying that it wasn't only you who are responsible, we're going to
At the moment, I cannot answer your question with families, because I mentioned general number, not taking into account. It happened that whole families, we know examples where 37 persons from several families were murdered for helping Jews. On the other side, individuals, separate individuals, were being arrested and murdered.
Chciałbym uzupełnić do tego. Ja chciałem uzupełnić 2 punkty.
Please let me comment on 2 points.
Pierwszy, liczba Polaków, którzy pomogła Żydom.
The number of Poles who helped the Jews.
To nie jest możliwe to powiedziano,
It's impossible to state a fair number. It was already
ale
mentioned.
przypominam, kara śmierci była za danie jałmużny, podania wody, podwiezienie. Ja nie mówię o ukrywaniu. Ukrywanie była kara śmierci. Czyli podanie kromki chleba była kara śmierci od 1942 roku, a w Warszawie od października, listopada 1941.
I would like to comment on this, that the death penalty was given to people who would even give water to a Jew, or who would give money to a Jew, or who would give a ride to a Jew. For only this, the person would be given the death sentence. And we're not speaking here about hiding the Jews somewhere. It was just about giving them money or water or bread, whatever. And that was since 1942, and in Warsaw since November 1941.
W Warszawie było około 10 000 dzieci żebraków.
In Warsaw there were around 10,000 children that were begging.
Z tego więcej niż połowa żydowskich.
More than half of that were Jewish children.
I one wychodziły poza getto
And they were leaving outside of the ghetto.
I otrzymywały jałmużnę.
And they were getting some money from this begging.
Za to groziła kara śmierci.
And for that particular thing, they were at risk, the people were at risk of getting a life sentence, a death penalty.
Żadne z tych dzieci nie dało świadectwa. Nie mówiło o tym, nie powiedziało później. Żadne nie dało świadectwa o tym.
None of the children told us that story later.
Dlaczego?
Why?
Ponieważ w lipcu 1942 roku
Because in July 1942,
Niemcy rozwiązali problem dzieci żebraków żydowskich.
the Germans solved the problem of the Jewish begging children.
Wszystkich wysłali do Treblinki i zamordowali.
They were all sent to Treblinka and murdered.
I one nie mogą opowiadać, kto im pomagał.
So they cannot tell you now who helped them.
Teraz chodzi o liczbę zamordowanych Polaków za ukrywanie Żydów.
So now speaking about the number of Poles who were killed for having helped the Jews.
Nie jest decydująca liczba zamordowanych,
It's not so important about the number of people who were killed for helping,
tylko metoda, w jaką Niemcy stosowali.
but the method that the Germans applied.
W każdej gminie, powiecie, wystarczyło zamordować jedną rodzinę z sąsiadem,
In every region, in every commune, it was enough to kill a family and the neighbor of this family.
i w promieniu gdzieś 20-30 km rozchodziło się wieść i strach.
And that would be enough for around 20-30 kilometers of a perimeter, because that was spreaded, of course. People were terrorized, and nobody wanted to be killed with their families and the neighbors. So that prevented other people from helping.
I to był cel Niemców.
And that was the goals that the Germans had.
Czyli zastraszenie przez terrorystyczne działania.
So they were terrorizing the people.
I to funkcjonowało.
And that was very efficient.
Ja to znam z przekazów rodzinnych i ze źródeł, ze wszystkiego. To wystarczyło 300 ludzi zabić w taki spektakularny sposób, żeby zastraszyć dużą społeczność.
I know that from family stories, I know that from different sources, that it was enough to kill 300 people in such a horrible way to make other people be so afraid of helping that they would not.
Szczególnie zabijanie dzieci.
Especially killing children was very spectacular.
I osoba, która podejmowała decyzję chronić, ukrywać Żydów,
And the person who decided, I am going to hide the Jews, I'm going to help the Jews.
ryzykowała, że miała rodzinę oczywiście,
If they had a family,
ryzykowała życie własnych dzieci.
they were risking not only their own life, but they were risking the life of their own children.
I ja nie znam w żadnej cywilizacji nakazu, gdzie jest obowiązkiem ryzykować życie własnych dzieci dla chowania innych.
And I know no order in any country that
Civilization, culture.
I know no civilization or culture where there's an order that you have to risk the life of your own children for
Thanks.
doing something like saving Jews.
Wojciech? Oh, okay.
Not an historian, and I can't comment on the numbers debate, but I want to mention some acts that are erased by history and that can never be enumerated. There's an excellent documentary called Number 4 Street of Our Lady, which you can watch the entire documentary online, Number 4 Street of Our Lady. It's about a woman named Franciszka Halamajowa, Polish peasant woman living in a town that's largely Ukrainian, where she is receiving threats from her Ukrainian neighbors. And in spite of that, she kept a Jewish family in her pigsty. And after the war, that Jewish family discovered that she had another Jewish family under her kitchen floor. And they also discovered that she had a German Nazi soldier who deserted, living in her attic. And single-handedly, she took care of all these people. Why do I mention her? I mention her because her neighbors knew, and they didn't tell anyone. So history cannot record those acts, and we cannot enumerate those acts, that these Polish and Ukrainian people passing this woman's house knew that she had Jews living in her pigsty and never told anyone. I also want to recommend a book by Oswald Rufeisen. I think it's called Daniel in the Lion's Den. He's a Jewish man who survived by disguising himself as a German. After the war, he converted to Catholicism, and he became, I think, a monk or a priest, Brother Daniel. And in his book, he records again and again average, everyday interactions where Polish people recognize him as Jewish and do the slightest thing that helps him or that paves his path so that he can survive for another day. And again, these people are anonymous. These actions can never be recorded. I also want to mention Władysław Bartoszewski's book, Samaritans, which is very similar to Rufeisen's book, in which Bartoszewski, who himself is a righteous Gentile, he was part of Żegota, he was in Auschwitz, and after the war he was the all-Polish Anti-Racism League, he was a co-founder of that and very active in that, and imprisoned by the Soviets for that activity. He describes Polish people who just, giving a glass of water and being killed for that. When I reviewed that book on Amazon, my review was the only review. So think about that. So go buy that book and review it on Amazon and put it in your school library and your public library, because that is our duty. And I also want to mention another act that cannot be enumerated. There were Polish people who said to their Jewish neighbors, I will help you. And I think there's two famous cases, if I remember correctly, and you can Google it and tell me if I get this right. I think both Janusz Korczak and Bruno Schulz rejected help. And not only were there famous people who rejected help, Janusz Korczak, of course, wanted to stay with his children, which is admirable. I'm not criticizing him. But he had Polish friends who said, you can pass as a Pole, I'll take you in. And he said, no, thank you. But there were also not famous people who said, Polish people, their Polish friends said to them, I will take your children and pass them off as Catholic. And the Jewish parents said no, because I do not want my children to renounce their faith. And I'm a person of faith, and I can understand that attitude. But there were Jewish people who were offered help who turned it down.
Thank you.
And this is for Professor Berendt. Someone said we have lies, damn lies, and statistics. When you quote 80 people in Drohobych and 200 saved people, this statistic makes no sense, because with 600 calories per day, 80 people would not be able to support 200 people. So there has always been some network, and it has to be taken in consideration always.
I think we understand it's so very difficult to give numbers. Personally, from my family, my mother's uncle, he was a priest in the township of Orniany, which is now Belarus, which is pretty big township, well, 200 or perhaps 300 souls. He saved 24 Jews. But he was, of course, able to do this with the help with all the others. But he was a priest for over 20 years before he was totally regarded as a kind of a saint. And why we know about it so well? Because in 2200, one of the descendants of the saved Jews reported, I would say so, to the Yad Vashem. And he, Jan Sholevich, was recognized. That's how we know. But how many cases when the reports really reached Yad Vashem? We have to remember there's also a motion situation. Very often those saved, they did not be only very grateful to those who helped them, because they were also surviving in a horrible situation, and for them it would be a very painful memory. And so many of them did survive. So only assumptions. I would rather be inclined to be mistaken on the positive side. Thank you so much. And then I'm not saying that my family, my grandparents were also hiding Jews. Anybody reported, and my aunt also saved one Jewish girl who survived with her till 46, for instance, yeah. And I believe there must have been many more. And then, just one of our members of our community in Bay Area, his family and his grandfather, being a forester, he ran the whole big operations, and so many, and nobody cared to ask him what he has done. It would be impossible to actually, you cannot ask the Jews who were saved, and you cannot ask all people who lived in Polish Christians at that time to get any really reliable numbers. Thank you so much.
Sir. Yes, you just, Mr. Zamoyski, no? The lights are tough over here. I can't see anything, to tell you the truth. Can we have the lights on in the entire hall? We're not going anywhere. I mean, we're leaving in a little bit. There, we are on? But can we shut those off? The ones that blind us.
Okay, thank you. I think it's working. Just a quick question. This is a general question about information about World War II crimes in general. I have long had a question in my mind. I would love to have found a digital or written copy of the report of the Israeli War Crime Commission. I've heard of it, read about it many times, but I've never been able to find a written report. Now, maybe it's buried somewhere in Israel, don't know. Does anyone here have any idea, had they ever seen a digital or written copy or some confirmation of where it might be, the Israeli War Crimes Commission report, in which it states, and I've seen this a number of times, certainly from Richard C. Lucas's book, The Forgotten Holocaust, that no more than 0.1% of ethnic Poles were complicit in denouncing Jews during World War II. That figure is a well-known one, I think, but I'd like to, has anyone found the original source material for that? Anyone?
Guess the answer is no.
It's not exactly that, but perhaps it will be helpful. On 15th of October, there was a book published by Harvard University Press by an Israeli professor, and I don't recall his name. Perhaps you do? No. It's called Bitter Reckoning, and it's the story of Jewish collaborators and their trials after the war, and it basically traces the attitude after the war when the survivors were still mad and people were tried, but they were nevertheless not condemned to death. And the attitude changes over the years to a point where you really cannot judge these people. So I think it's a book that you might find helpful, but it appeared because documents have been deconspired, so to speak. They have been led into the daylight within the past.
Bitter Reckoning.
Bitter Reckoning, yes.
October 15 this year.
This year, yes.
Somebody from Harvard.
Harvard University Press. Yes, I have a couple of other comments, if I may. I would like to recall a book by Mark Edelman, who is a survivor of the ghetto uprising. And in his estimate, you needed 7 people to hide one person.
True.
So my question is to somebody who perhaps knows about it, what were the logistics of hiding someone? Because apparently you needed a chain of people. It involved probably not keeping a person all the time in the same place, feeding them, bringing food so it didn't appear suspicious that you're bringing more food than necessary. I mean, there must have been some things that made it difficult. The second question I have is the issue was addressed about the laws against helping Jews in the cities. But I also heard that there was an escalation of laws in the villages, and they basically eventually got into the point where entire villages were burned. And of course, once you got into that point, it was such an intimidation tactic that the amount of people who were helped declined, just out of sheer terror, basically. And the third thing is that you cannot put a number on the people who helped. I have 4 people in my immediate family who did, everyone in a different way. This was not a subject of discussions or repeated memories. I remember it was mentioned, it was not something that people usually came back to. And not everybody got recognized, and you also need to differentiate between people who actually helped and the people survived, and the people who saved people and something happened on the way and they didn't survive. So how do you get the numbers? I think it's sheer impossibility. And then on the top of that, there is the problem of the fact that so many of Polish Jews were Hasidic. How do you hide a person who doesn't speak fluent Polish? Hasidic Jews mostly spoke either fluent Yiddish, but also patois, or the kind of, that's why we say żydłaczenie.
Pidgin Polish.
Right, Pidgin Polish. And then the last point, sorry. You helped because you knew people, and people trusted you, and you trusted them. I think this is a point which is completely forgotten. My grandmother helped because she was a merchant. She knew a lot of other Jewish merchants who came to her. And unfortunately, she also helped somebody who she didn't know and who framed her. So there was collaboration on both sides. They were also Jewish collaborators, unfortunately working for the Gestapo. And she was sentenced to Auschwitz. But I really think you cannot judge people who are put in moral situations which are absolutely beyond human endurance, because I think these situations, you're asked to make choices which are not possible for a normal human life, I think, in many cases. And there is a very interesting article by Israel Shahak, who also was born in Poland but lived in Israel. He was a professor. And he wrote, after Shoah came up, he wrote an article in the New York Times Review of Books in 1987, where she addresses this issue of the need of people to return to a normal life, even though there are horrors all around you. And this happened this happened also within the ghetto, because obviously there were people dying on the street, and people are, I think, desperately want to come back to normal life in extreme circumstances. So we're trying to quantify how many people helped, but I think it's very simplistic. It's a very, very complex issue.
Okay, we're going to
And nobody will have the final answer.
Well, we're going to ask Professor Berendt to try and weigh in on a couple of those issues. Would you mind, sir? And this will be the last.
In fact, what I heard,
Which is next?
No, this will be the last one, but he's going to respond to the ladies.
What we heard is not in contradiction to what I told, what I presented during in my paper or later. What you mentioned, there's no contradiction. So about a net of help. Two general types of situation. That, for example, Stella Zilberstein was held by about 67 persons, such a number she mentioned in her story of her survival. One girl, 67 persons. It is one example. On the other hand, I mentioned Drohobycz. So the family, couples of Wołosiański, he and she, and in 1944, a child was born to them. And they use the baby
crib,
wózek?
Crib.
Yeah. To get the potatoes and other products from different shops to collect for 37 persons. Nobody helped. There was no net of help. They used money and material gathered by these 37 Jews, also their own money, and it was the net. It was another Pole, Stella Zilberstein, and these 37 people held by two Poles. And in Drohobycz, there was one Ukrainian, and they took no money for themselves. It was not a source of income for Wołosiański couple. On the other hand, in Drohobycz, there was one Ukrainian family who helped hide 46 Jews successfully for money. And there was no net to help this Ukrainian family. And taking into account all entries in the Encyclopedia of Polish writers among the mentioned, and I read these two volumes several times, every entry. I can tell you that it is approximately to survive what is mentioned, a number of rescued people and a number of rescuers in the household. The proportion is like about 1 rescued person to 1,2 rescuers. What we can get from information, quantify, yes, it is a problem. But if it is such a large problem, why we mention 1 million? We can describe only the types of situation, the way in which people were helped. But we cannot name the number. If we cannot name the number, so do not name 1 million, because it is from the floor. It is taken from the floor.
So it's, I'm done.
We can name, and I mentioned in the paper all these peoples who will stay nameless. And I told that during my presentation. And this number will stay unknown because of the lack of sources.
Thank you so much.
I will be quick. May I just ask clarification? Where's the mic? Here.
Okay, Gordon Black, Polish American Congress, Northern California. Thank you.
For you, Gordon, for you.
Thank you, Professor Barrett. I just need to ask a clarification. The title of your presentation is Gross's Thesis Reconsidered. I'm not sure I got clear what that thesis is that is being considered or reconsidered. Could you state that thesis, please?
So, what I told, there are people, and Jan Tomasz Gross is among them, who want to present the multi-million Polish society, Poles, but also our Polish citizens, as a population where maybe the majority felt satisfied with what happened to Jews. And I am against such a presentation because there is no confirmation of such an attitude of people, because they omit the conditions created by the German occupants with terror and bribery of people. And all these conditions, all the situations, circumstances, generally are omitted in the text describing the behavior of these robbers, blackmailers, collaborators. So it is this reconsiderations of the thesis of generally anti-Semitic attitude of Christian on the territory of occupied Poland. First of all, Poles, but in this you know that the majority of local population in this was Ukrainian, Belarusian, and Belarusian. So it is my reconsideration of Tomasz Gross and his colleagues' thesis.
It attacks the culture. It attacks the culture. In his words.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for your attention today. We're going to have Dr. Śliwowski give us an announcement or two.
One quick comment. I know a couple people cited some other references, books and movies, and this lady back here brought up the point about the Hasidics not speaking much Polish. I don't know, I think recently saw the movie, I think it's called The Courageous Heart of Irena Schindler, where it shows she had friends who were Jewish and she went out of her way to save people, but it was one of the first movie I've seen that I thought showed some of these details that we speak about, that it was the first movie that showed that the Jewish people mostly spoke Yiddish, and the light bulb went off in me. I said, oh my goodness, how could you possibly easily hide a Jewish person or help them if they can't speak Polish? So that was the first thing, and some of these other points that you made that I'm forgetting, but so I just think you mentioned the legislation, and then the other point about the legislation where only in Poland could you be killed for just giving them a piece of bread or water or giving them a ride. So with those two things, how daunting to help someone to save their life when you're being terrorized. Oh, the other point was just when you put these parameters of the timeline, that how Poland was invaded in 1939, and then these legislations, these ordinances increased, 1 year later, 1940, 1941, 1942, and this climate of terror, as a couple people mentioned, imagine yourself living there. We stress out on a given day here because of the stresses of life and have fights and difficulty. Imagine living under those conditions and being ready to snap in a year, and people are asking you to try to help someone when you're under constant stress of being possibly shot, any gesture you do. Imagine 2 years into it with increasing risks, and so of course people are going to start losing it and saying, I can't trust my neighbor, and who's going to help me, and who's going to turn me in. I can only imagine people changing that climate.